Hello, I am Joseph Jordan, with my wife Jean, who is just coming in, are members of Rancocas monthly meeting. We have invited you here this evening. My family lived here in the mid-40s and 50s, and we lived in the brick house, which is just west of town on the southern side. There are a couple of giant buttonwood trees in the front of the house. Even 70 years ago, they were too tall to climb. Now, historic Rancocas, one of the oldest buildings in the village, is the Friends Meeting House, dating from 1772. I was just looking at that when it planted the Salem oaks, and I said, 1772, math major that I am, that's 250 years. It was built 1772, and it was built by the area's Quaker farmers and tradesmen. There was nobody else here except the Quakers and the Lenape Indians. Our burial grounds at the end of Bridge Street are sharing the same burial grounds that the Lenapes have used long before our time. In fact, occasionally when we're preparing for a burial, they may find a bone which is immediately pressed back into the side of the pit. Earlier, Quaker meetings were held in private homes until a log home was built. The school was built also for educating Quaker kids as well as Lenape children. After the log building was no longer sturdy enough for the meeting's regular use, the current meeting house was built 1772. The current schoolhouse, which is just on the other side, was built in 1821 and has been in near constant use for educating children. It is active today. The meeting house is in use to this day with a small group of active members, and I see some prospective members here. We have a treasure here, and we're honored to share it with you. It's Williamsburg North. After Michele Tarter's presentation, please join us for refreshments at the Meeting House, where we have all been meeting for so many years. Now, let me introduce Dr. Michele Tarter, a resident living across the street. Not there, over a little. Right. I can't tell you exactly where. She has been researching Quaker spiritual mothers for the last 3 decades, and her latest book, New Critical Studies on Early Quaker Women, 1650 to 1800, features research on the first 150 years of the Quaker movement. These women, healers, prophets, imprisoned writers, itinerant preachers, abolitionists, educators, and authors, formed a transatlantic literary network promoting the early Quaker practices of prophesying and writing. Dr. Tarter.
Good evening, friends. It is so great to see you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. So what I want to do tonight first is take you on the journey I was on when I found a lot of this material. I did not know it existed, and when I discovered it, it really rocked my world. It was 30 years ago, but it's still so alive in my heart, my spirit, in not only my scholarship, but my spiritual path as a Quaker. And I became a Quaker in the midst of doing this scholarship. I had attended Haddonfield Friends School, but I had never become a friend. And so this was in Boulder, Colorado, in the PhD program, and I went to Boulder Friends Meeting where Elise Boulding was a member. And she would stand up each Sunday and tell the stories of these early Quaker women and their diaries, their journals. She did so much with the manuscripts and the material that hadn't gotten out into the world. And I thought, wow, I want to be Elise Boulding when I grow up. So anyway, there were only at the time 2 books about Quaker women that were sort of foundational. One was called Quaker Women by Mabel Brailsford, written in 1915. And the other was Margaret Hope Bacon, Mothers of Feminism. You've probably heard of that one, 1986. So they were sort of my groundwork. Elise would not stop. She just told me story after story. So finally, I applied for a scholarship to go live and study at the Friends House in London. And that's where the material is, the archives, the buried material. It's just down in their vault. And so I got this wonderful fellowship to go and live there all summer. And I went, I didn't know a soul. It was a little brave of me, I imagine, back then, but you feel fearless at that age, I guess. And I went, I lived in a tiny room, and each day I got to the Friends House Library. There were only 8 seats there. 1 table with 8 seats around it in an old, musty, dusty library. And if you didn't get one of the 8 seats, you stood the whole day at a podium and read. They had 8 seats. So I was first in line every morning next to Kenneth Carroll. And he was my buddy. I don't know if you've read any of his work, but he did some extraordinary scholarship on Quaker studies. And so I plunged in. I started reading anything I could find that the earliest Quaker women had written. Who were they? I was trying to get a sense. Who were these Quaker women? I knew nothing about them except for those 2 books that existed. And everything else was written by men, and it was most predominantly about Quaker men. I couldn't get to the root of where were the women? I want the stories. What's happened? The first convert to Quakerism was a woman, Elizabeth Houghton. George Fox convinced her, and she took off. He gave her the keys to the kingdom. And so I read and read and read these manuscripts. I saw picture after picture of Quaker women, often portrayed with like a witch's hat on, right? Or on a soapbox, which was very pejorative at the time. If you're standing on your soapbox and you're just ranting, you're almost crazy at the time, culturally speaking. These are all anti-Quaker paintings that were done in the 17th century, anti-Quaker. And so why? Because there's a dog preaching with them. See the dog on the left? The woman's on her soapbox. She's got the witch's cap on. The men are all sort of falling over, writhing, doing odd things. This is not traditional worship. Here she is again. Here she really looks like the Wicked Witch of the West. Okay, and so I kept saying to Kenneth, what's going on here? Why are all these portrayals happening of the women? And you see people are almost swooning. They're falling over. And that was pejorative because in the Quaker meetings, when they gathered, things were going on that the onlookers were terrified of what was happening in these worships because there was no minister at the front, right? The inner light lives in all people, men and women, right? And even animals. Many Quakers brought their dogs to the worship. They would meet anywhere. They could meet in a barn. They could meet under a tree. They didn't need a building. It was the inner light inside of them, and they preached to each other. Well, this was terrifying to mainstream Anglican society, right? There's one more. Oh, hold on. Now this one is a little bit disturbing because that's Satan behind her. This is sexualized, and a lot of these became very sexualized because a woman who spoke too much, which is what Quaker women would have done, right, preaching, was automatically sexualized into being a loose woman. If you're loose with your tongue, you're loose with it all. And so this would have been absolutely like ruining a reputation. And yet, why did so many women follow the call? That's the question I had. What was so great? What was going on? Okay, so I decided one day that I needed to go to the source. It was great to sit in a library and read and read and read and get one of my 8 seats. But what I really wanted to do, I wanted it to pulse inside of me. I wanted to go to where Quakerism was born. And so off I went. I first went to Pendle Hill. I climbed up the top. This is where George Fox had the vision of Quakerism, right? And I learned from the locals that this used to be called the Witches' Hill. Well, that really excited me because, wait, whoa, what are those connections? And there was a huge witch trial there, and this is up in northern Yorkshire. And what happened is after the alleged witches were killed, they were all executed, hanged. The next day, locals say, the face of a witch appeared on the hill. And the fauna and flora made a figure of a witch. And so it had a lot of superstition attached to it. And that's interesting because shortly after is when Fox climbed the hill and thought about bringing men and women together in spiritual equality to preach the word of God. I mean, that's pretty radical for the day and on top of Witches' Hill. So I really got excited about that. I would never have known if I had sat in that library and just read. I would never have known that. So then I was going on my journey here. I then went to Brig Flats Meeting House, which Fox built. He had this built himself, and I fell in love with that. Worshipping in that meeting house was special. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, and that's the back of it. I went to Furbank Fell, where Fox convinced 2,000 friends, and that's considered the beginning, the onset of Quakerism, and I loved going there. I was quaking. I was quaking up there. I felt it. I got it. I went to Swarthmore Hall, Margaret Fell, her manor, and looked in the windows. That's me peeking in the window. This is inside the meeting house at Swarthmore. Very old, very special. And I went to Sunbrook Burial Ground, which is where most of the early friends are buried, in unmarked graves. Very spiritual place for me. I then went to the Lancaster Castle Dungeon, and this is where they put all those Quakers. In the cells, no light, dark, cramped, unsanitary, and so many extraordinary things came out of people in that Lancaster Castle Dungeon. At the dungeon, next to the dungeon rooms, they have the torture instruments that were used. And this was the one that stopped me in my tracks. I never knew this existed. A 20-pound iron cage put on a woman's head who has too much tongue, who talks too much. And that iron, that gadget could crush spines. I mean, 20 pounds, imagine. And the woman would be led through the streets where people would throw rotten fruit and vegetables at her head. A scold's bridle. A scold was a woman who had too much tongue. So Quaker women got it a lot. That one, that was it. They had me then. Okay. And I said to the man at the tour, he was talking about Quakers terribly. I was most insulted. And he said, they need to just learn to be quiet. We did not have a good interaction, he and I. Margaret Fell wrote Women Speaking Justified from that prison. Now that's an interesting piece, but that's for another day. She married George Fox and became the mother of Quakerism. So very, very special, Margaret Fell. I was trying to get a sense of who these early Quaker women were, why they chose Quakerism when they knew it was going to possibly end their lives. And I am not exaggerating. end their lives, at the very least, to be physically tortured, bruised. But people felt absolutely legitimate to just walk up to a Quaker and beat them, throw them in the gutter, stone them, pelt them. I'm sorry to say this, but even urinate on them. I mean, they did really horrible things to Quakers. So why take up that badge? Like, what was going on there? Why did so many people follow George Fox? And of those people, so many women. So many women. And I researched, I looked at it, and what Fox was giving to them was a new sense of the divine. The divine lives inside you. You don't need to go to school and get your education. You don't need to be paid clergy. You're not elitist. It's for everyone. It is reviving the primitive Christianity. And when you feel God pouring your spirit onto flesh, you are celestial flesh. That is the term he used. You are heavenly flesh. You are radiating with God. And it is apocalyptic. It is here, it is now, over and over and over again. We're not waiting for Jesus to come in the new, what's it called, like the second coming. It's happening every time you quake with the Spirit of God. Revolutionary. And for women, why was it important? Because Fox said to them, first of all, God came to a woman and said, you will give birth to the Savior. And so Mary becomes this extraordinary figure. And secondly, Fox said, we're not separating the body and the spirit, which is what traditional dualistic Christianity does. If you have a spirituality, it comes from your mind. It comes from your spirit. It has nothing to do with your body. Body, according to traditional Christianity, is dualistic. It's separate. The body's decaying. The body's mortal. The flesh will die. The body doesn't matter. But Fox said the body does matter because that's how we feel God pulsing inside of us. He fused the body and the spirit together. And that gave women a whole new position in the church. Why? Because women were always associated with body and men were associated with the soul and with the mind. That's very ancient from the earliest Christian fathers. They set up that dualism. That's what it's called. Body, spirit. They're separate. Woman, man, separate. And why are women associated with the body? Because they give birth. And that's what men don't do. So the Christian fathers denigrated that. That's not to be trusted. Do not trust the body. If you go with the body, you end up with temptation and you'll die. Right? Fox said the body is divine. The body, it's celestial flesh when God fills you with spirit. This is called enthusiasm. Enthusiasm. You are enthused by the Spirit. And Fox said, that's great. So women suddenly had an entirely new position in this Quaker movement because they were revered as spiritual mothers. And so in the meetings, when they were quaking, when they were moving with the Spirit, often women simulated birth. Think about that, because it was the most divine experience. And the children, the other Quakers are called the children of light. It's all really interesting about motherhood and how it is sanctified among the earliest friends. Isn't that interesting? I know, I get really charged and then I forget that you're all here because I'm so in it. All right, so George Fox himself, I don't know if you know this, he wanted to be a doctor. He wanted to be a healer. And he was looking for a way to heal, and he realized it was through the Spirit, that the body and the spirit are so connected. He did hands-on healing all the time. He kept a book of miracles, which documented every single healing he experienced or helped others. This is an anti-Quaker portrait of Fox, crazy lunatic man, right? Because you see, he had something that was so threatening to mainstream society. And he was conducting healings, and he was keeping a record of those healings. Oh, that's me back then. And this is in Breakflat's meeting house. Sorry, that's me writing. So, celestial flesh. All right, so I've talked about that, right? And that's what one becomes in the moment. This is Fox on spiritual mothering. A mother in Israel brings forth to God and nurses up the children of God. A mother gives suck and can suckle and nourish and teach the young ones the truth and strengthen, for she has the breasts and the milk of the word. This is the language they used over and over again. The breasts of consolation, the milk of the word of God. And so they made the language was quite physical, as was the experience of quaking and filling up with God. The children of light, everyone would gather around the mothers. Here's one of the spiritual mothers, Sarah Blackborough. Feel the fruit of the Holy One springing in thee, moving to be brought forth in thee towards God and man. If it is not brought forth, it withers and becomes as dry bones in the womb. So when you feel God stirring, don't ignore it, or it will turn dry and dead. Give it life. Give it sound. Speak it. Move it. Whatever you feel in the meeting. Then the women went forward with this. The spiritual mother said, not only should you come to meeting and feel God and let this expression come forward, you should then write it. That God wants you to inscribe it on the page, and once you inscribe it on the page, writing it with immediacy, urgency, just like you prophesy if you're moved to language. You're moved to movement, language, then be moved to writing, because your spirit will be captured in those words. And then when those words go forward, it will move the readers. So literature, literally, the words, your letters, anything you write filled with that spirit will in turn affect anyone who picks it up and reads it. That God is like a living instrument through language that holds spirit too. Isn't that interesting? It's not just our bodies, it's our language, our writing that is also divinely filled. And it can convince others just through the act of reading. These are revolutionary things for the time. Do you see what I mean? It's really exciting. Okay, let me keep going. So, Dorothy White, the word of the Lord came unto me saying, write, and again I say, write with speed. They wanted people writing. They saw the potential of the Quaker movement to spread through writing. And as soon as you wrote things, the Quakers would publish them. They would disseminate it, move it, and the ministers would travel all across the colony, England, the whole UK, over to the colonies, and pass out the literature, spread it, keep it growing, keep it growing. In the first 10 years of the Quaker movement, there were 60,000 members. It moved like, it was like a dynamo. It just kept going because people loved the excitement, the enthusiasm of it. And it was open to anyone, men, women, children, elders, anyone who was moved, and even races. I mean, this is an interesting moment of diversity, because when you look at their interactions with Native American Indians, indigenous people on this continent, it's very exciting. Fill not your heads, but feel the life of what in this following paper is declared. Don't be stuck in your head. Read with your heart. I love that. And that life may fill your vessels, that bowels of compassion and tenderness may flow one into another, that every soul may swim in the fullness of love, that all may be filled with the eternal power. These are the kinds of things they wrote. Oh, that into my mother's house you all may come, and into the chamber of her that conceived me, where you may embrace and be embraced of my dearly beloved one. So they really started talking about God in a maternal way. And again, that's revolutionary. But they felt that's the experience they had of the divine. O ye tender plants who are sucking the milk of your mother. By reading her writing, you are indeed sucking the milk of your mother. They saw it as a form of breastfeeding. O feel the breast of everlasting consolation. Draw, drink abundantly. There is no end of this pure river, whose waters are as clear as crystal. And from the throne of the most holiest, the waters flow plentifully. And with you all I do lie down and rest, sucking at God's most holy breast. I think when I read that, I let out a scream. I was in the Friends House Library. That threw me over the edge. I just thought, why didn't I ever read any of this? Where has this been? And that's the question. So, in 1656, some of you may know this already, but James Naylor, who was a prominent Quaker, got into a lot of trouble with the law. Why? Because on Palm Sunday, he and a few of his women followers, and I think one other man, they rode on donkeys and sort of simulated riding. They rode into Bristol on donkeys with the palms singing, "Oh, Susanna," Hosanna, so not Susanna. Oh my God! Oh, Hosanna! And they, as if it was Palm Sunday, and he was the Savior, like he was Jesus, right? Well, the people of Bristol went nuts. They went nuts. That was it. That was as bad as it can get. And so they put him in prison, and they, I think they bored his tongue with a hot iron, and they branded him, and it was a horrible story. And Quakerism took a big hit for it, big hit. So after that, elders gathered around George Fox, male elders, and said, we have got to start pulling this in. This is getting crazy. And so that they did. A wave of censorship and conservatism started sweeping through the Quaker movement, and it had only been around for about, I want to say, 8 years at most. So this was most disturbing, and it caused quite a lot of trouble. Censorship. So it started growing right after the Naylor movement, but it culminated by 1672, which is called the second generation of Quakerism, where the male elders just finally started saying, you know what, this is too radical, everybody's too outspoken, it's gone too far. If we're going to save our movement, we're going to stop all of these religious outbursts of enthusiasm and prophesying and doing whatever you feel like doing. So they started a second-day morning meeting, which censored every single publication published by the Society of Friends, and to dignify the movement. And so many, many, many women wrote beautiful tracts similar to the ones I've shown you, and their response from the committee was, this is not meet to print. That means no, we're not printing that. And so all of these manuscripts just got lost, buried in the depths of the archives. And that all of that language was considered superfluous, it's too much, it ruined us, look what happened with the Naylor incident. If we're going to save the movement, we got to cut that out. And they did. They started reframing, reshaping Quakerism in a much more conservative, dignified light. And so here is just one example. William Penn said, by revelation, we don't mean whimsical raptures, strange and prodigious trances. We disclaim any share or interest in those vain whimsies and idle intoxications. I mean, they really slammed down on any kind of enthusiasm and prophesying. So the first generation of Friends was exceedingly enthusiastic. But within 10 years, they just started reining it in. But what happened to all that material of the first 10 years? It suddenly was disappearing. And in fact, when George Fox died, he left 3 things that he insisted must be published for all time. And one of those 3 things was his book of miracles. And it disappeared. It literally disappeared. No one ever found it. No one ever found it. Yep. Don't know. Don't know. That's what they would just say. Don't know. Go on. So Henry Cadbury, in the early 1900s, he went through the entirety of Fox's manuscript writings and remade a book of miracles based on every single miracle he found in the journal, in the letters, and he tried to recreate it because it was destroyed. Dignify the movement. So what happened? The Quaker women formed what we like to call a peculiar sisterhood. That is their term. They liked that term. Be peculiar. I like that term. I'm going to start using it. I'm peculiar. Peculiar is good. All right, I'll stop. So what did they do? Interestingly enough, when they were in mixed meetings, that is with men and women, they were ever so quiet, the women. Quiet, quiet. And as soon as the women's meeting and the men's meeting separated for business, the women got down to it. Mary Weston, a famous transatlantic Quaker minister, she wrote this in her journal. I found it. It was my lot to sit in silence until the women separated from the men. Among them, I was closely engaged for a considerable time, to the no small mortification of the men friends, many of whom left their own meeting and hovered about the door and windows very thick around the women's meeting. They looked out and all the men were like, what are they doing in there? Because they waited for a private space where they felt safe again to do the same earliest practices: prophecy, quaking, shaking, feeling the divine spirit pour back into them. Patience Brayton, another one. On Thursday the 15th, we attended the select meeting, and I was silent until the men withdrew, and the women's meeting came on. Then my mouth was opened, and it pleased the Lord still to cause the light more and more to break forth. Oh, how I felt the love of God to this people if they would be faithful to what is made known to them. So you see this over and over in the manuscripts. In the manuscripts, the diaries, the journals, the things that censoring committee did not have its fingers on. Because if they got their fingers on it, it was not meet to print and put away. And it takes archival research to realize the other half of that story. Martha Ruth, another one. I felt much nearness of spirit towards some women friends, and when separated from the brethren, my spirit was bowed before the throne of grace. That just gave me goosebumps. Okay, Ann Cooper Whitall, she lived around here. And do you know about her, Carlton? You nodded, yeah. So she writes in her diary, and I think I have a picture of her diary, yeah. She writes in the diary about how the Quaker women ministers would come. They'd go far and wide and visit meetings to keep that going, to keep that peculiar sisterhood going. And they would encourage the women to always keep journals, to write their spiritual practices down, to keep it going even when the ministers left. And writing was the vehicle for doing that. So this is her one page of her diary. You can see she's crossing things out on the bottom. This is a peculiar page to me. But I love that the women, they were all reading, all writing, and they saw writing as part of the spiritual journey. Their autobiographies were very, very powerful for their development as Quaker women. Okay. I wanted to say that the Quaker women traveled in pairs like the apostles, and they traveled far and wide. From Barbados to Virginia, from Nantucket to the Carolinas, just let me give you a few examples. And this is in the American colonies. This was my biggest point. The year that the Naylor incident happened, 1656, is the same year Quaker women started traveling here. They got out of there. They left England and started coming here. That is the exact same year at the exact same time. And no one's really ever articulated that, but the scholars I speak to all concur. And so let me give you a couple of examples. Jane Crossfield, in her transatlantic pilgrimage, she visited 266 meetings. She traveled on horseback 4,573 miles in 355 days. Margaret Cook, at age 54, traveled, she visited 71 meetings, 106 families. She rode on horseback 2,600 miles in 5 months, 1 week, and 1 day. Margaret, that was good. So many of these, just so many stories of these hardy women who put it all on the line and left their families behind because they felt God calling them to do this. And when they felt God calling them to do this, it was physical. Because remember, I told you, the body is so important. They literally felt that if they didn't go, they would die. They would have a heart attack or something would seize inside of them, and it wouldn't be worth staying anyway. So they would go and listen to the call of God. I love these stories. Okay, so my book. My book is based, it has 14 different scholars in it, all like a community of scholars, all writing about different new things about Quaker women, yeah? And so we as scholars are looking at a range of archival sources. We're looking at manuscript diaries and letters in the archives, itinerant preachers' memoirs, anti-Quaker tracts and broadsides, Old Bailey records from the prison, children's primers, meeting minutes, household inventories, revolutionary pamphlets, county clerk books, and prison logs. And that's how we're trying to put this story together. Why? Because the story of early Quaker women was intentionally buried by that second generation of male elders in the Quaker religion. I mean, it's hard to believe because Quakerism is most known for spiritual equality. That's the problem. That even though that is so, in this attempt to dignify the movement, all of those traces of the early beginnings were buried, including the Book of Miracles. And so now this is how we are trying to recover history. So here are just a few pictures of different things we looked at, letters, and you know, you have to learn to read this handwriting. It's not fun. Look, I had to read that. Right?
Did it get any easier?
Well, a little, yes. You start learning that, the S's and F's, that whole thing. But, some are brutal. And you just have to start asking people, the librarians, anyone who's sitting around. I love this picture of the Quakers, the women. Let me see. And this one. Okay, so the book it's set up into 3 sections: revolutions, disruptions, and networks. So the revolutions looks at how radical Quaker women were and how novel their ideas and practices were. And we look at women pamphleteers and women who wrote the king. Actually, one woman wrote the king and humbly directed him to sit in the dust. King Charles. So, well, not then. And another scholar writes about Quaker Women and Slavery. This is really interesting. He features Alice Kerwin, who went to Barbados as an abolitionist, and Mary Fisher Bailey Cross, who was a spiritual mother in South Carolina. They called her Mother Cross. And Sarah Lay, the wife of Benjamin Lay, I know you've probably heard of him, who was an abolitionist, and she went to Barbados and fed slaves at the back door where they were staying. So he's done a lot of research on the Quaker women, who really sort of broke a lot of barriers in terms of slavery. His work is phenomenal. And then Disruptions is about how women survive pressures from inside and outside the movement. Because now you know, it wasn't just outside the movement, it was within too. And they had to find their ways to still do what they needed and wanted to do. So we have, one scholar writes about how the Quaker women were sexualized in that propaganda, like the images I showed you earlier. Another writes about the ordinary women, not the women who went and broke all those barriers, but the ordinary women whose husbands were imprisoned and they had to take over the business, help the children, support the husband in jail, get him bedding, get him food. It wasn't like jail today. You had to pay if you wanted your loved one in prison to be eating and sleeping and so forth. And so she features a woman named Margaret Edmondson, whose husband was the founder of Quakerism in Ireland. And he was in prison 9 times for being this radical Quaker. And she ran the show. You've never heard of her. So again, this archival research really helps bring it to light. Sarah Crabtree, and this is down the penultimate one. She writes about Patience Brayton. This is one of my favorites. I probably shouldn't say that. But I love this essay because she brings to life how hard it was to be a traveling minister in early America. This woman, Patience, was beyond anything I've ever read before. She left behind her children and husband and said, God's calling me. She tried to turn around twice to go home and she couldn't. She said, I'm going to die, and just listened to God and kept going. She often didn't know where she was going. She would just listen to her body and say, okay, we have to turn left in the middle of a forest. And then they'd end up at a Quaker's house. I mean, Stuart, you can't believe it, but she recorded it. And she... Okay. Was that Patience? Wait. All right. So she writes about the roads and the rivers that she had to forge. Treacherous, unpredictable weather, snowstorms. A horse threw her and she was severely injured. She dislocated her wrist. She refused to lodge in houses that relied on slave labor. So she would instead sleep on the floors, sleep on corn husks, sleep on the bare ground outside. She rode 128 miles in 3 days to get home when she finally felt released by God. And when she got home, her youngest child, who was very sick, died 12 days later. So she then suffered the guilt of being a bad mother. And in fact, Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote a short story about her. And it's about a mother, a Quaker mother, who left her sick child. So, I mean, all of those criticisms were out there, as you can only imagine. And yet here she was as a spiritual mother, mothering in other ways for the greater good. And that's an interesting conflict. Finally, the last section is called Networks. Oh, there's a picture. And in Networks, it looks at how Quakerism expanded its network while remaining separate from the world, like to be of this world but not in it, and how they stayed connected. So one woman writes about Hannah Griffiths, who was a Quaker elite in 18th century Philadelphia, and she formed a group of Quaker women writers. They never published anything. They circulated their manuscripts with each other and had an entire manuscript culture. Very interesting way to skirt around sort of the patriarchy that was squelching them. And then Jean Soderlund, and perhaps you've heard of her, She writes an article in here that is so important, such good work, about the frontier outpost of West New Jersey. So this is where we are. She writes that upon arrival in the colonies, these women and men lived in wigwams, caves, cow stalls. They had relations with the Lenape Indians. Some did intermarriage. Richard Haynes came in 1683, and he married Mary Carlisle, who was an indigenous woman. And this happened radical for the time, before 1700. And there's a lot of Haynes names on these houses. We are Haynes encircled. And my son let me know we're related to all of them. He's done genealogy 27 generations back. He's obsessed. And he said, you're related to so many Quakers, and I think we're related to every neighbor. So, all right. If you want your genealogy done, Ted Tarter, right here. It was a diverse community because we had Lenapes, Swedes, Finns, Dutch, and English Anglicans surrounding in this region. And the Quaker women, part of their biggest work was building community. It's a very diverse community and ways to interact and connect people. They did a lot of poor relief, helping the poor, supervising marriages, discipline for the girls and women. And so Jane Soderlund has done so much work in sort of reconstructing what it was like to be living back then and to be what Quaker women had to endure. Anyway, the book itself adds so much to the annals of Quaker history because we've unburied all of those archives, all of that material, and we've shown how these women express themselves with their revolutionary faith, their disruptive agency, and their transatlantic networks through the magnifying power of community. And that is the book. And that is it. I'm done. Oh, God. Thank you. Oh, my goodness. Are there any questions? Yes, Linda.
Why in the meeting house do the women and the men not sit together?
Okay, so with that, at some point in time, with all of that censorship, the Quakers someone decided that the men and the women should sit in together, but not mixed, like they should have their separate boundaries. And then in the business meeting, which is after the worship, they literally put a divider between. The women went on one side, the men went on the other, to do the men's, women, and the women's business. Very separate. So it's all part of that fallout where equality was sort of challenged as a term. Yes, we're equal, but you take care of the marriages and the discipline, and we'll do the work of the world. That's men speaking. And don't come knocking on her, no. You do yours. But then when the women would start doing all their things, the men came to the keyhole and the windows and, what are you doing in there? So isn't that interesting? All right, more, yes.
Looking back at the early illustrations you had of the Quaker women and the soapboxes and the dogs.
Yes.
Maybe people didn't notice that the dogs weren't there just as dogs. They were peeing on the women. In each of those pictures, the dog has its leg lifted, urinating on one of the women.
Oh my gosh.
Look back at the pictures.
Now? Are we going to do this? All right. Uh-oh. I think I goofed. Oh, I really goofed. Can I not do it now? All right. All right. Thank you. I will be looking, and I'll never forget it.
It's just another way to make it pejorative.
So pejorative. Woman is body, woman is animal. These Quakers are acting like women and glorifying women. They are satanic. They're possessed by the devil, not God. Anything in the body has to be, absolutely not of God's word. So, good. Yes.
Hi, I've enjoyed your presentation very much.
Thank you.
I went to Haddonfield Friends. We'll chat later. but you're younger than me, I'm sure. But my question is, I've always been entranced by that Quaker women had more rights than non-Quaker women. They could own businesses, their husband didn't get all those women's money when they married. They could be educated. When did that start coming around?
Well, I think by law, laws change all the time, but I think among the Quakers themselves, they instituted it. They were sort of like in a bubble, and they were willing to do that, but they got a lot of flack for doing that societally. And so they had to sort of negotiate how much they wanted to go for it or not. But when most of the Quaker men were in prison, as I said, the women were already doing it. They had to survive. Right. So I think it just kind of morphed into that it became a practice, and then it didn't let up. Okay, yes?
I have a question about, so you told a story about the woman who left her 6 sons who died 12 days later. I was wondering, if God tells you to do something, does that make it a morally correct decision? Like if she could have helped her son, but God told her to leave him, would that mean that it was still the right decision because God knew? Or would it be that she should have put her son before God?
Your question is so profound. So she's asking, in other words, I think what you're saying is it right to listen to God if your son is home dying? Is that pretty much what you're saying? What's your name? Sorry? Caroline? Okay. Really good question and deep. That's a deep one. And I don't know if I can answer it. But oftentimes people are called to do things that terrify them. I'm thinking of Moses with a stutter. I don't think he wanted to go get those 10 Commandments. I don't know why, he just came to my mind, but that's a decision that each of us has to make. Do we listen or not? And what would happen if we don't? And if there's ever been anything in your life where you knew you had to do it, even if it was going to get some pushback, but you had to. And if you didn't, it felt awful. I think that's what she was going through, and she writes about it in her diary. The guilt she had when her son died, I can't even convey in words. Profound. Probably for the rest of her life. But she knew her husband was there. Her husband's name was Preserved. Is that a great name? That was the first name. Preserved and Patience Brayton. I don't know what the child's name was. I should know that. But he assured her he had done everything he could possibly do. He tried to help assuage her guilt, but she wrestled with that, Caroline, for the rest of her life. And I can't, if I had that answer, my goodness, I'd invite you all to my palace. No, I mean, you know what I mean. It would be an answer for the world, but thank you for that question. Yes.
I'm wondering what Fox was doing during this transition when the men decided to cave into society.
Mm-hmm. He struggled terribly. He came to the colonies and traveled. He did more healings after that than before. So he was sort of subverting even while all that order was being instituted. I think he didn't want that regimented control over the mystical, but he felt, or he was convinced by them, that if they didn't do that, everything would fall to naught. So I think he struggled to the end of his life with it. And then look what he got for it. They didn't publish his Book of Miracles. That's not good karma. Right? So I think he struggled, and I wish more people would do something about that, like write about it, think about it. Yes, Carlton?
When was the last time the Book of Miracles was seen? Like, was it right after his death that it disappeared, or was it like later on?
He knew he had it, so until he died, he had it. And after he died, no one knew where it was. But in his will, it is one of the three named. My letters, my journal, and my Book of Miracles. And we have the journal, and we have the letters. But even in the journal, the original journal is not the journal you read and buy today. It has been severely edited. And if you go to the Friends House Library and look at the manuscripts, remember I showed you those pages? There's huge ink strokes through certain parts and pages. Big black, they're violent to me, ink strokes. And some pages are cut out, they're ripped out. Like not the whole page, just a chunk of a page. There's a scholar, Richard Bailey, who calls, the word he uses is they're bowdlerized. It's a very old British word. But like they're destroyed, it's violent.
Mutilated.
Mutilated. Yes, Melanie, that's another good word. So something was afoot.
There's no chance it'll be found, I'm sure.
It's never been found. Carlton, you find it. I tell my students all the time, go find it. I still have hope. They find Emily Dickinson poems up in the attics of Massachusetts. They found a photo of her. It was on eBay. It sold. My professor found it at an antique, like a yard sale thing. So you never know. Find it. I think it's around. I've been saying this for years. I think it is to be found. But could we do it in my lifetime? All right, other questions? Yes. Oh, Lois, sorry. Okay, yeah.
When the people were editing or striking, what was the intention? Can you tell what their intention was in doing all this work?
Well, one thing that somehow this scholar could read through some of the ink strokes. Isn't that interesting? And he, with his magnifying glass, and he said that often in the journal and in the letters, well, the letters that were transcribed in the journal, the other Quakers referred to Fox as Dear Holy Father. They called him names like God because they believed that the imminent Christopresentism, like Christ is alive in us, and so they took that to the extreme, calling him Holy Father, Divine Father, real godly terms. And when they were trying to dignify the movement, they wanted to cut all of that out. So that's one example. But there could have been, the healings, the miracles, the enthusiasm, the quaking, who knows what else was cut out. Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to ask if you know, are there more resources about Sarah Lay besides what people have written about Benjamin? Because I don't think they've written enough about him either, but she seems like so hovering in the background of the whole story.
They always are. So there is the book on Benjamin Lay that came out relatively recently, but I don't think she gets much attention in it, right? It still needs to be done. It needs to be done. If I could have gotten an article on her, it would have been in here. It wasn't out there. No one was working on her.
I mean, because she had disabilities. She was like, he was
really
to
tiny.
Be married to, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So I would love to. Well, and I'm glad to know that I'm not missing it now.
No, you're not. But do it. Wait. I want this. Why not? There's still so much need. So much need. Any other questions? Any other reflections, thoughts?
I'm wondering if they could do some sort of forensics on the bits of writing that have been crossed out.
They probably could.
I just got goosebumps. That tells me you are right, Carlton. Do it. You're the tech wizard. Go get them.
That's your meetings, Carlton.
Yes, you have a calling. So, right. Bring it on. And now the Friends House Library, I'm happy to report, it has been renovated. And there are many seats in there and desks and beautiful. It's all cushioned seats. It's not like the real hard wood. It's a lovely place to go. It doesn't smell like dusty, musty. My allergies awful. It's beautiful. So go there. It's on Euston Road in London. We drive by it every summer, don't we, Ted? I'll say, no, there's the library. And it's a special place. So I urge you, carry on the work. We've only tapped. So I have one more thing I want to say before I end, which is I promised to do this talk to teacher Nora years ago, my beloved Nora Dunphy, and I told her I would do it, and then sadly she left us, and I haven't been right. Talk about calling. I have not been right until tonight, right here, right now, because I know she's here. And she wanted me to share about the Quaker women and how important they are. And she was another great Quaker woman. Then she will always, always be in my heart and in this village's heart, and her beautiful daughters here. So I just wanted to say that, and thank you to the meeting for helping me celebrate this 250th anniversary of this meeting house. A lot of these women and women after them came to this meeting. This is where it happens. So when you walk in there, I want you to breathe in the Spirit, because I think they're still around, guiding us forward. Thank you all. Thank you for coming.